Hello everyone and welcome back to Deck Tech Tuesday. In this series I go over a random deck of my choosing, and for this week we're staying in Standard and we're actually going with a super budget deck, and I'm really excited to show you guys. The deck we're going to be looking at is Crush of Tides. Now Crush of Tides is a mono blue deck and it's focused around two cards, that being Crush of Tentacles and Rise from the Tides. I did have a version of this deck built in the previous Standard, but it was a blue-green variant based off of the blue-green Crush list, and it used like Part the Water Veils and stuff like that to win, and ramped with a bunch of ramp cards like Nissa's Renewal and stuff like that, and it stabilized by gaining a bunch of life and like taking extra turns and getting 8/8s and all that kind of fun stuff. However, with this build, since we lost stuff like Den Protector, I wanted to play with green in the deck still, because we do have like some instant speed ramp cards, the 3-drop instant speed ramp spell, I can't remember what it's called. I mean, the pieces are there kind of to build the blue-green Crush deck, but it really needed Den Protector for it to work. So my thought was, in the Standard, how would I build it? And I decided that I wanted to build it mono blue. And you know, you could play like the more powerful cards like Part the Water Veil. I think in an ideal Crush deck you still want to be playing Part the Water Veil and like Jaces and stuff like that. But regardless, since we're going with the super budget version, that being under $30, which I'm pretty proud of myself.
Why would you be proud of yourself? You made a budget deck. Kids do that all the time, and people who don't have money for cards, you're nothing special.
So let's go ahead and get a look at what's in the deck, and we're going to start with the namesake cards, first off being Crush of Tentacles. We're playing a pair of in the board, and normally it's a 6-drop sorcery that bounces all non-land permanents back to each player's hand, kind of like Evacuation but a little bit better. But if we cast it for its surge cost, it's reduced from being a 6-drop to 5-drop, and as an additional bonus we also get an 8/8 out of it as well. And this card kind of counts as a win con in our deck because it does give us an 8/8, but since there is a lot of removal that's running rampant, like Unlicensed Disintegration and Ruinous Path and like Declaration Stone and stuff like that, it's not our main avenue of winning. It's just another way of like blowing stuff up off the board and like maybe getting an 8/8 in the process as well. So our next card is Rise from the Tides. So it's a 6-drop sorcery, and I know that's a bit costly, but whenever we cast it, before I actually get into the card, this is a spell-based deck. 27 spells in the main board are actual non-creature spells like instants and sorceries and stuff like that. So say we cast Rise from the Tides after we cast a bunch of like bounce spells and counter spells, we can probably get like 10 or 11 zombies out of this and swing with a bunch of tutus. Now, albeit they do enter the battlefield tapped, and this is where cards like Part the Water Veil comes into play, because we just get to take an extra turn while also casting this and ideally winning in that situation. However, with here, since we're going in a budget way, we're just going to have to cast this to where we have enough mana to back it up with counter spells. And I know that seems a bit much for like 9 mana, but we are playing 26 lands, so it's not too far away or too impossible to be able to cast it and like back it up with counter spells. And for our last win con in the deck, we have a pair of Dynavolt Tower. Now, Dynavolt Tower is a 3-mana artifact. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we get a pair of energy counters, and we can pay energy into it to bolt like a creature or somebody in the face. Again, since we're playing 27 instants and sorceries in the deck, this card is inherently synergistic with already what's in the deck, and we also have 8 cards in the main board that produce energy, so those cards help out Dynavolt Tower in return. Starting off with our instants and sorcery spells, we begin with the 3 of Anticipate. Now Anticipate, thank God this card is instant speed, because if this was sorcery speed, this card would be nigh unplayable. Like, I wouldn't even consider playing this in the deck, but since we are playing a bunch of counter spells, you know, being able to look at the top 3 and grab a card at instant speed, this card is playable in here, even though there are better draw spells, and we will be playing those draw spells, but in that case we're not playing a full playset, we're only playing 3. For our next draw spell, I mean, it's not really a draw spell, but it is card advantage, and it's a 4 of Pieces of the Puzzle. Now this is an interesting card because normally I would not play with something like this because it dumps a bunch of stuff into the graveyard, but since we are playing Rise from the Tides, we get to take advantage of that by putting a bunch of stuff in the graveyard and finding something like Rise from the Tides, for example, or you know, just being able to dig faster to it, so that way we can cast it and have an easy amount of instants and sorceries in the graveyard without needing to counter spells or anything like that. And for our last card draw / card advantage spell, we have a full playset of Glimmer of Genius. Now this is one half of the cards that will help benefit Dynavolt Tower, but in addition to that, we also get to scry 2 and draw 2 at instant speed, and this is pretty much as best as you're going to get in terms of draw spells in standard, and this card is fan-freaking-tastic. I can't tell you guys how much I really do love this card. Starting off with our counter spells, we begin our 13 counter spells in the main board with a 2 of Unsubstantiate. Now, it's technically not a counter spell because it does return target spell to its owner's hand, but I will consider it a counter spell in that regard since it pretty much delays anything that the opponent might slam down for an entire turn. And in turn, you know, we could have another counter spell that we draw from our next turn in the process. Now, albeit that's not the best kind of situation, but in addition to it not being able, or in addition to it being able to bounce a spell back to its owner's hand, we can also bounce a creature. So anything that they might have invested a certain amount of time into, you know, this card would really nail that, like something like Ulamog or Emrakul, if Emrakul still existed in standard for that matter. But then again, if I think about it, you really don't want to return an Emrakul to the hand. That's just a really bad punt of a play. For our next counterspell, we have a 3 of Spell Shrivel. Now, Spell Shrivel, it's 3 mana, counter some unless they pay 4. I think there's another card very similar to that in Standard that was previously printed in Ravnica, if I'm not mistaken. But in addition to this not being able to also counter a spell unless they pay 4, it also exiles it instead, so it's very akin to something like Void Shatter or Dissipate for that manner. So I'm playing this over that other spell that I can't really remember the name of. For our next counterspell, we look at what I previously mentioned, and that's a full playset of Void Shatter. So Void Shatter, 3 mana, counter something, and it exiles it instead of putting it into the graveyard, very similar to Dissipate, except that this card is colorless as well. So one of the weaknesses to it being colorless is that it's prone to something like Ceremonious Rejection, so whenever you're playing this deck and you see a single blue mana, you definitely want to keep an eye out for something like that. Next up, we have a 3 of Scatter to the Winds. Now, I know what you're saying, this is cancel, but just slightly better, and that's kind of exactly why I'm playing it, because yeah, while it is cancel but slightly better, it does provide another creature for us, albeit it's not too big of a creature because it'll be a 3/3 for 7 mana. Oh, such great value, right? But it does provide another body so we can get in some damage, and even though they'll set up like maybe a removal spell to kill it, you know, hey, that's just one more removal spell that we don't need to worry about for something like our Crush of Tentacles, for example. And for our last counter spell in the deck, we have a 1 of Confirmed Suspicion. So I was pretty hesitant on this card when I first saw it spoiled in Eldritch Moon because, you know, 5 mana for a counterspell, it better do something pretty fantastic for it to be playable, and lo and behold, turns out making 3 clue tokens is what makes this moderately playable. Not too like awesome of a card, but you know, it made me consider being able to play 1 in the main board because, you know, we can crack these clues at instant speed, and since this is virtually an instant speed deck anyways, you know, having cantrips available to us to crack at instant speed, you know, that's just pretty valuable to us in general. And for the last of the spells in our deck, we run a total of 5 enchantments, and the first 4 is going to be Ether Meltdown. So this is the other half of the energy cards that I was talking about beforehand. We're playing a full playset of this and Glimmer Genius to help out with our Dynavolt Tower. Not only that, but it's a flash speed enchantment that gives creature -4, -0, or vehicle as well. And it being flash is pretty key in this deck because, like I said, a majority of this deck is instant speed save for like Rise from the Tides, Crush Tentacles, Dynavolt Tower, and the lands, and our last enchantment. That's a pretty low number amount of sorcery speed spells, so we're pretty much just holding on to everything on our opponent's turn until we've exhausted their resources, and Ether Meltdown helps out with that tremendously. And for the last spell in the main board, we run a 1 of... This is a pet card of mine. Now, I can understand if people don't want to play with this card, but I genuinely think that it's playable and that it's slightly underrated and people should try it out a bit more, and that's a 1 of Imprisoned in the Moon. So my love from this card first started from playing Commander, because this is virtually a blue Song of the Dryads, whereas where this card can hit a creature, land, or planeswalker, Song of the Dryads was much better, as in it was green and it could hit a permanent. But regardless, this is pretty much a blue removal spell for a planeswalker, save that they don't have an enchantment removal spell, because it turns off the planeswalker, land, or creature that may be giving us trouble and it turns it into a colorless source. Now, granted, this card gets worse if they have something like Natural State, but hey, you know, at least we got rid of like dealing with the Gideon for a couple turns, so I'm completely fine with that. And this also locks down any bothersome creatures, so that way we don't have to deal with them later in the game, so that way whenever we just counter stuff or we can mass bounce spell, you know, that also resets our Imprison in the Moon, so we can recast it on another threat. Moving into the lands, this is pretty easy. We only have 2 different types of lands in the main board, and we're starting off with 23 islands. Now, we are playing 26 lands in the main board because, well, this is a control style deck, and sometimes in some situations we may need to be able to cast 2 or 3 counter spells in a single turn. We need to make sure that we have the mana to do that, so we're running 23 islands. In addition, we're also running a 3 of Blighted Cataract. This card I also found very interesting because it's draw on demand on a land. Now, previously I have talked about Gaia Reach Sanitarium, and I just don't want to drive you guys crazy. I would be playing a Gaia Reach Sanitarium in here, a one of course. But I wanted to showcase this card because I think this card is actually kind of sweet, because for 6 mana, we get to draw 2 cards. Well, 7 if you count sacrificing the Blighted Cataract. But since we're playing an instant speed deck and we have 26 lands, you know, being able to get that off from our 3 of Blighted Cataract shouldn't be too hard of a task. Starting off with the sideboard, we're going to be looking at cards that are in the main board that we help finish out in the sideboard, and that starts off with 1 Unsubstantiate. Now, we bring this in against stuff where tempo is more valuable, like an aggro deck where it's actually pretty valuable to make sure that their first 3 or 4 turns, it pretty much renders their stuff useless, especially if we can just keep like bouncing Grimflayer or Walking Ballista back to their hand over and over again. Unsubstantiate helps considerably with that, especially since it also returns a creature. In case like it resolved the previous turn, we can just draw it and then hit it and they have to do it again. And so I definitely want to bring this card in against that type of matchup. And we also have one more Imprison in the Moon. Now, like I said before, this is a pet card of mine, and I want to bring this in against more Planeswalker heavy matchups or something like Mardu vehicles, because being able to hit Gideon, because Gideon is priority number 1. It's public enemy number 1 for me in the format. I just want to be able to kill as many Gideons as possible, and hey, Imprison in the Moon helps me do that. So looking at all the rest of the counter spells in the deck, we begin with the 2 of Dispel. For 1 mana, we get to counter pretty much their Void Shatter or any other instant spell that may hinder us and in our plan. This also takes care of stuff like Grasp of Darkness or any other relevant removal spells that are instant speed as well that I can't come to mind or think about, like Lightning Axe, or hell, like even our opponent's Glimmer of Genius 1 mana counter. I'm totally fine with that. And for our last actual counter spell on the main board, we have a 3 of Negate. Now, Negate not only counters our public enemy number 1 Gideon ally as Zendikar, but pretty much every other Planeswalker, well, definitely every other Planeswalker in the format, and it also hits like other Dynavolt towers or other bothersome enchantments or artifacts. And it being 2 mana, clearly you can tell that this is Wizards' like fixed version of Counterspell. We're pretty much not going to get anything better than this, so we might as well take advantage of Negate while we can. So I realized while I was editing the video that I completely skipped over a card in my sideboard, and that's a 2 of Disperse. So this card is pretty similar to Unsubstantiate, except it bounces other stuff in addition to creatures. Namely, we want to be bouncing stuff like Planeswalkers when they're about to ultimate, or any other types of permanents on the board that's given us trouble. So we do have some additional bounce spells in the sideboard, and that's a 2 of Engulf the Shore. So I did want to play more Crush of Tentacles, but I was thinking to myself, the card is just so expensive. And I mean, yeah, we are running 26 lands, but there's going to be situations where it's not ideal for us to cast Crush of Tentacles because, you know, casting the 6 mana might leave us open for something, and that's where something like Engulf the Shore comes in and practically saves us, because we bring this in against super aggro heavy decks, especially if like our opponents already crewed vehicles and stuff and they entered combat, and since this is an instant spell, we can just cast it, bounce everything back to their hand, and they have to start from square one, and that leaves us open with some mana ideally, so that way we can like Void Shatter, Heart of Kirin, or some other threat, for example. For our next spell, we're bringing in something that I've been testing for a little bit, and from what I've played with, I've liked, and that's a 3 of Ice Over. So Ice Over here is kind of like Ether Meltdown. Instead of giving something -4, -0, we get to tap it down and it stays tapped. And not only does this hit creatures, but it hits artifact as well, so in case they have some sort of pump spell that can get around Ether Meltdown, you know, this card will just pretty much take care of that, and it prevents like a creature from being able to crew again, because again, that creature is locked from tapping and untapping. And for the final spell in the deck, we're playing a card that it is oh so near and dear to my heart. When I first saw that it was spoiled, I just went gaga over it, and that's Sphinx of the Final Word. While you can reasonably play this card in the main board, I just have it in the sideboard and bring it in against other control style decks, so Sphinx of the Final Word is pretty much the end-all answer. And in case they do have something that like can deal with it, like Wrath or a Sacrifice, Edict Effect for example, well, we can just cast our counter spells that can't be countered. And that's the deck tech for you this week, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is this something that you'd want to play with? Is this something that you'd ignore because it looks a little janky? And I don't blame you, this does look pretty janky, but if you give it an actual shot, you'll see like within its consistencies and just how it plays as just like a pure draw go style deck. It's just very near and dear to my heart. Remember to subscribe, like, comment, all that jazz and stuff. And anyways, I'm Tasty Snackies. You all have been wonderful, and I'll catch you on the flip side.